This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today, we are venturing into the depths of the Minneapolis underworld for a tale of the city's most infamous gangster, Isadore Blumenfeld, a.k.a. Kid Cann. Now, most infamous is a bit of a subjective characterization, but I don't think any name rivals Kid Cann's in the criminal history of Minneapolis. There was a time when it wasn't uncommon to see the name Kid Cann emblazoned in large letters on the front page of local newspapers. In some cases, these were huge headlines that ran the entire width of the front page, like Kid Cann placed on trial and Kid Cann is killer, eyewitness says. So it's understandable that he became a household name. Our reader wanted to know more about this fascinating figure from the city's past, and joining us today is reporter Andy Mannix, who profiled Blumenfeld for Curious Minnesota. Here's my conversation with Andy. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. So, all right, first of all, this is office serendipity moment. I'm talking to a colleague about how we have this question about Kid Cann, and then it turns out you used to live somewhere that's very relevant to Kid Cann.
Yeah, I lived in the apartment building that a journalist named Walter Liggett had lived in and was killed in the alley behind it in 1935, and Kid Cann was tried for that assassination of this journalist who was a great critic of Kid Cann.
Right, which we're going to get into, but that's kind of what launched you. I was like, hey, well, then you should do it. You should do the story then.
I've always kind of been interested in learning more about Kid Cann. You know, I lived there 12 years ago, but I was a journalist, then, and I was sort of like, I had never heard this story before about a journalist being murdered by a mobster in Minneapolis. So I've always been kind of interested in learning more about that. And so, yeah, when I heard you mention this one, my ears perked up.
Right. Kid Cann is the most famous gangster likely in the city's history.
He was extremely famous. He was well known. People would recognize him on the street. People have sent me many emails and left me many voicemails since we published this story about their dad or grandfather playing poker with Kid Cann or going hunting with them, or he would come into their store. So this guy was extremely well known in Minneapolis for decades.
Okay, so Kid Cann is not, it's a nickname, which he hated, which we'll talk about in a second, but his name is Isadore Blumenfeld. What's his backstory?
So he was born in Romania. He was Jewish, and he moved to Minneapolis with his family in, I believe, 1902, when he was probably 1 or 2 years old. And they came by way of Duluth, settled in North Minneapolis, as a lot of particularly Jewish immigrants did back then. Yeah, so he grew up on the streets of Minneapolis.
You paint a very colorful picture of him trying to make a buck on the streets of Minneapolis.
Yeah, it was a hard life for people like him. His dad was a peddler of, trinkets of some kind. It was a very anti-Semitic time. Minneapolis was considered one of the most anti-Semitic cities in America at this time. So there just weren't a lot of opportunities for a young Romanian Jewish immigrant who, didn't have a lot of wealth in his family. So he and his two brothers would make money doing things like finding a bus transfer or a newspaper in the garbage and reselling them, delivering coffee for a nickel, pickpocketing, just any way they could, make a dime here or there. Mm-hmm. That's how they were doing it.
Okay. So sort of fast forwarding here a little bit, Prohibition in 1920, alcohol is banned throughout the land and throughout the country. And I was just watching a documentary about this, and it really focuses on how Prohibition turned a lot of maybe small-time criminals into sort of big money-making criminals. And Kid Cann is a perfect example of that, just like Capone in Chicago, maybe on a smaller scale. So Prohibition is really where Kid Cann blossoms into a big name.
Absolutely. He went from, in Prohibition, small-time street urchin, small-time hustler, to a millionaire, who would become, in many people's eyes, sort of the boss of the criminal underworld here in Minneapolis. And you can imagine someone with the sort of street knowledge he had, that grit, that ambition that he had, to prosper in a time where there was a lot of people who wanted alcohol. There's a lot of people who felt very conflicted about Prohibition, and he was able to get it for them. He was able to keep the Twin Cities wet for all of Prohibition through a booze ring that it was very sophisticated. It wasn't just he had like a still in his bathtub or something like that. He would travel to Canada. He would travel down to New Orleans and work with other people like him to funnel booze into Minneapolis and St. Paul. He at one point was going to Cuba and flying Cuban rum into Minneapolis and St. Paul. And he became very well known as sort of the guy to go to back then if you wanted champagne for your daughter's wedding or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. So and in this process, he made millions of dollars, which is still, I think, a tremendous amount of money.
Right.
But certainly in the 1920s, early 1930s, that was a hell of a lot of money. So he was very, very successful.
And he develops this nickname around this period, which, eventually the newspapers would really solidify it. I don't know if they came up with it, but I mean, probably not. But I mean, that's where it really became linked to him inextricably. But what's the deal with Kid Cann? His name's Isadore. It's not Kid. There's no Cann anywhere in his name. So.
No. And I didn't know this until I started researching the story, but he hated this nickname. It's not really definitive where the origin of Kid Cann derives, but the two stories are one being he was a boxer as a young man, and Kid Cann is, it was like his boxing persona, and it stuck. No evidence that he ever actually did box, so maybe that theory is not accurate. The other one is that whenever the shooting would start, he would go and hide in the bathroom or, in the parlance of the time, the can. So you can imagine why he would not want people to call him that to his face.
Right. And he said once, and you quote this in the story, that's just a name the politicians or the newspapers use when they want to blame someone for something. All you hear in this town is Kid Cann this and Kid Cann that. He's clearly not happy with it. And does he ever sort of go to jail for all this bootlegging that he does?
So part of the Kid Cann story is they just could not get anything to stick. He was arrested several times for bootlegging. Somehow he would just skate without spending a single night in jail. There's one story I found where he was indicted in New Orleans and he just didn't show up for his trial and they just dropped the charges. So all these different ways he would get out of it. This became a reputation he began to develop during Prohibition of being sort of untouchable or just finding a way to skate. And then that would translate in a very big way to his larger story. He
did get charged once with a shooting, right? And this plays into something we're going to talk about in a second. But tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So there are two stories I found, both of which he was essentially a suspect in a shooting. One of them was, and this was during the Prohibition era, there was this big argument between him and like a cab driver, and he ends up shooting a guy in the spine and paralyzing him, and the guy eventually dies. Well, the Hennepin County Attorney's Office says that was an accident. A few years later, there are these two Minneapolis police patrolmen who are shot. Neither fatally, I don't think, but Kid Cann is named as a suspect, and he is actually charged in that one. Later on, though, the charges are dropped after the Hennepin County attorney says that there just isn't enough evidence to pursue the charges. And the Hennepin County attorney is a guy named Floyd B. Olson, who would go on to become an important part of the Kid Cann legacy.
Right. Okay. So Prohibition ends early 30s, but Kid Cann, he's got a huge empire now, and he's running a lot of it from the Flame Cafe, which had a couple different names, but the building is still there on Nicollet Avenue.
Yep.
He's like you describe him as sort of a fixer. I mean, what is he doing back there? This is also a time of a lot of corruption in the city.
Yeah, this is a time where corruption is pretty rampant in Minneapolis. Kid Cann is now sort of a power broker. He's holding court in the Flame Cafe with beautiful women, with politicians. He's a very well-known figure by the end of Prohibition, and he becomes very influential in things like if you want a liquor license, if you want a nosy inspector to go away, if you need to bribe someone in City Hall, which was apparently quite easy back then, Kid Cann was the guy to go to. And this was a very different time where that was all just kind of business as usual.
So you referenced when we started this conversation, this journalist getting shot. That journalist is Walter Liggett. This is a very key part of the Kid Cann story. It's not just another shooting. This is really the big thing that still lingers around his legacy a lot. So first of all, so who is Walter Liggett? Who is this guy that is at the center of that tale?
So Walter Liggett is a journalist. He had worked at the New York Times. He had worked for some of the big papers over the years. He was well known as sort of a labor activist. And at the time of Kid Cann, he and his wife, Edith, are publishing their own weekly newspaper called The Midwest American. And in the Midwest American, they are really going after the political corruption in Minneapolis. So Liggett in this time particularly sets his sights on Floyd B. Olson, the governor of Minnesota, a larger-than-life figure in his own right, who sort of brought the Farmer Labor Party to the mainstream.
This is the former prosecutor that we talked about earlier, who's now become governor at this point.
He was a rising star, Floyd B. Olson. Exactly. He had been the Hennepin County attorney. He's now the governor of Minnesota. He's rumored to be, running for president of the United States. This is a very influential, very powerful person in Minnesota. And you have Walter Liggett writing that he is in bed with the mob, that he's selling political positions to immoral people, that he and people like Kid Cann are doing business together. And he is really going after him. He writes, I think it was like 10 reasons Floyd B. Olson should be impeached, included in every single weekly copy of the Midwest American. Mm-hmm. He sends a copy to every single legislator in Minnesota. He does speeches about how Floyd B. Olson is this corrupt man who needs to be essentially removed from office. He was more than just a squeaky wheel. He, I think, really threatened Floyd B. Olson's future in a way.
And he starts getting like threatening calls and then more than threatening calls.
Right. Threatening calls, people telling him to stop. And he and his wife continue writing about this in the newspaper. One time he is beaten up by essentially a band of hoodlums that he says was led by Kid Cann. And his wife, Edith, writes about it in the Midwest American, says that Kid Cann tried to bribe him to stop writing these things. He said no, so they beat him up. The police say Walter Liggett was drunk and started a fight. So you kind of get these two different versions. And by the way, great photo that Eric found in the story of Walter Liggett after getting beaten up. And then, so this is 1935. You have that fall. These charges come down from the Hennepin County Attorney's Office that say that he was involved in some kind of statutory sexual assault. And he says, this is a frame-up. I'm being framed by my critics to silence me. And he's ultimately found not guilty of those charges. And then a few weeks later, he's assassinated.
And this is where we get back to that apartment building, which is right near Stevens Square in Minneapolis.
Right along Stevens Square Park there.
And it's like, this is sort of like a very theatrical scene, right? It's winter time. There's a car pulling down an alley with Liggett and his family in it, and then there's another car behind them.
Yeah, it's straight out of a movie. Liggett gets out, motions for his family to stay in the car. A Tommy gun appears out of the driver's window and guns him down, 5 shots, tight circle around the heart. Professional hit, not like someone's just shooting and there stray bullets everywhere. This is a professional hit. You could tell right away. And then there's a photo of the cigar chomping detectives and journalists standing around this body. Edith, his wife, kind of cradling her dying husband.
But Edith saw who did it, she said.
And she says, I saw who did it. I saw his snarling smile. It was Kid Cann.
Wow. And this is 1935?
December 9th, 1935. So Kid Cann is named as a suspect immediately in the paper. And he says, I've got an airtight alibi. I was at the barbershop getting my weekly shave and what have you in downtown Minneapolis. And there are plenty of people who will account for my whereabouts.
Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of like, this is a trial of the century is a cliche and probably not even accurate, but this is a big deal, this trial of Kid Cann, because it's like they maybe finally got something on this guy.
Totally.
And so everybody's swarming suddenly around this event.
And just to really briefly set the scene here, he was the third journalist who was murdered.
Liggett was.
Yep, Liggett, in a period of about 2 years. So this drew tons of national attention to have someone who was a critic of Floyd B. Olson, of Kid Cann, of all these people, murdered in this way. It became a national and eventually international story. It knocked the Lindbergh baby story off the front page. We had journalists from London coming here to cover the trial, the New York Times. This was a big deal. This was not that sort of run-of-the-mill corruption that Minneapolis and America was used to at that time. This was something quite a lot more sinister.
Right. And the reason there's still this sort of mystery surrounding this event is that Cann, after this big trial, which we won't get into all the details of, he's acquitted. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, he was never convicted of this.
Yeah. It goes to the jury and they come back 90 minutes later. It wasn't one of these like drawn out for weeks kind of stories. The jury comes back, says not guilty. And there are pictures of him in the newspaper the next day, kissing the hands of the female jurors who acquitted him in his three-piece suit. And you can, as you can imagine, this really solidifies his reputation as Minneapolis's most famous gangster.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is 35, and the trial around then.
36, yeah.
36. And so we sort of, he doesn't disappear from the scene. He's still around, and we're going to sort of fast forward again. And we talked about this on a past episode, but he becomes involved in the Twin Cities Rapid Transit Company and sort of ultimately the dismantling of the streetcar system, which sent a lot of people to prison, but not Kid Cann.
Yeah, and we had this great streetcar system. It's sort of bought up by a bunch of people, including Kid Cann, by a bunch of investors. And he would say, I was a businessman. I was investing in all kinds of different affairs. This was one of them. But yeah, a lot of people go to prison or are charged at least, for this racketeering scandal. Kid Cann once again skates.
Right. I mean, essentially what was happening was they were in the dismantling, they're selling all these assets at like heavily reduced rates, and then there's kind of like allegations of kickbacks and Kid Cann's connections to some of the companies that are receiving these things. And anyway, so and if you're really interested in that, we had another episode on it, which I'll link to in the show notes.
It's such a fascinating facet of all this and just like Minneapolis history, because this really paved the way for what Minneapolis is now in some ways, right?
Right. So just like Al Capone, another famous gangster, Kid Cann, the reason he went to prison ultimately was not because of some of the crimes he was most known for. So why did Kid Cann go to jail? Because he did go to prison for a couple of years.
So Kid Cann finally gets busted. He's charged with a statute that I don't think is around anymore, but it was called like the White Slave Traffic Act.
And this would be in, what's the time period here? Because the streetcar stuff was in the late 50s, so now we're in the early 60s?
Yeah, we're in the 1960s. And, basically he became very enamored with a specific prostitute from Chicago, and he would pay her to come spend time with him. There was a lot of interest from the federal authorities in investigating Kid Cann's sex life. He's found,
and we should just point out that part of the way we know about the interest in his sex life is because Paul Maccabee, who is a key source for this story, we should point out, has done a lot of research around Kid Cann and was very helpful for this story, that he did some FOIA-ing. He sort of probed into that a bit.
Yeah, and thanks for saying that. Paul Maccabee, who's written a lot about Kid Cann, he wrote a book about John Dillinger and sort of the gangster world here. He put in a FOIA request for a bunch of these federal law enforcement files of Kid Cann and found that immigration services were investigating him. They discovered that he was bringing this prostitute in to spend time with him from Chicago. Crossing state lines, we could get him with this.
And they do, and he goes away.
Yep. So he goes to Leavenworth Federal Prison. I think spends a lot of that time in a hospital, his health declining at this point in a prison hospital. I think he serves about 3.5 years in prison. So that's the first time that Kid Cann really, spent some real time. But it's not a life sentence by any means. He gets out and he's sort of back to business in a way.
And he's done with this town.
But he's done. He headline in I don't know if it was the Star or Tribune says Kid Cann sells out. He's leaving Minnesota. So he finally decides he's had enough. He tells the newspapermen that he's sick of being he's not going to get kicked around by Minneapolis anymore.
Right.
He's going to Florida. He's got enough money where he doesn't need to do any deals anymore. This is what he says. He's sick of being called a mobster, all this stuff. So he moves to Florida, and a few years later, the Miami Herald does a fantastic investigative story tallying up sort of the organized crime interests in building this city called Miami Beach and who owns the most seafront property of anybody, Kid Cann.
Wow.
And he's teamed up with, he's got a bunch of the Minneapolis Syndicate, as they were called, his sort of local mob here. A bunch of them were involved in this, as well as a guy named Meyer Lansky, who, we could do a whole podcast episode on him, but probably the most famous member of the mafia that was not Italian. He was a Jewish immigrant, I think, just like Kid Cann. So they teamed up together and essentially built what is now Miami Beach.
Okay. And so Kid Cann's ultimate sort of death was not, he didn't die in a sort of barrage of bullets or something like that. He just sort of died of, was it like heart disease or something like that?
Yeah, bad heart.
Man?
Yep, 81 years old, 81, presumably extremely wealthy still. Living in Florida. So he did not have that ending that a lot of these famous gangsters did. He did pretty well for himself.
Yeah. Well, Andy, this is such a fascinating story. I think Kid Cann is one of these names that, I don't know, if you read enough about local history, you sort of come across this name a fair amount, but I never really knew the full story. And I had heard the Liggett story, but I didn't know why it was so important to Kid Cann's story. And so I appreciate you putting this all together for us in this story.
It was loads of fun to dive into the archives and sort of learn all of this stuff. And also, by the way, as a crime reporter, to see how they reported on crime back then. So fascinating.
Right. Well, Andy, thank you so much for writing this up for us.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay, that's it for today's episode. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. If you've got feedback for us or a question you'd like to see answered, send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.